the temple, he saw the money changers, and he saw how they would sell animals that could be sacrificed when everybody was there for Passover. And he threw the tables down and he got angry, righteous anger, because something was lost over the years. And I wanted to start with what I think is the most important quote from the Bible that deals with the Ten Commandments. And that is from Leviticus 11:45. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, be holy because I am holy. We have God asserting his godship. I am the Lord that brought you out of Egypt to be your God. And then his command to be holy because he's holy. When we look at how tonight we're going to focus on what the Ten Commandments were to Israel when they were first presented. And they weren't presented in the way that the movie depicts. They were presented verbally from a mountain where 2 million people could hear the voice of God. And we're going to talk about what God had in mind and what Israel had in mind at the time that these commandments were presented. Next week, we'll look at what became of the Ten Commandments. What did the deep state bureaucracy do with it? And by way of illustration as to where we're going, I wanted to talk about the Constitution, the United States Constitution, because you can go back to the archives and you can see a parchment of the Constitution that occupies 4 different cabinets where there's glass over them, and you can look down on the face of the parchment, and there are 4 of them that contain the United States Constitution. And that's originally in 1787 when it was adopted, when it was written, and then in 1788 when it was ratified by the different states. These were the 4 pages of the parchment, handwritten. And if you go there, you can get a little pamphlet that's just a pocket-sized pamphlet. And you can get a copy of the Constitution and the amendments to the Constitution, and that's 13 pages on a printed pocket-sized pamphlet. But boy, if you go into look at the analysis and interpretation of the Constitution, which is up, it's a publication that's updated yearly. It includes all the interpretation of the Constitution by Supreme Court decisions over the 200 plus years of American history. And if you look at just those, it's about 3,000 printed pages. And we're not talking, it's like a telephone book printed pages. They're small print. Then if you add all the statutes, the United States Code, the Code of Federal Regulations, which are all the bureaucracy regulations and everything else, and administrative rulings on those regulations, you would need over 1,000 volumes that would fill a small library. And that occurred over just about 200 years. How 10 commandments became what Israel had is like what happened with our Constitution, except that the 10 commandments came about in about 1350 BC, and then you get Jesus coming in 1,300 years later. And during that 1,350 plus years, boy, the Israeli people did a lot to expand on what God's law. And so we're going to talk about how what was originally spoken and then written on 2 stone tablets. Later next week, we're going to talk about how it expanded to all of the ritual and procedures and things, and what effect it had on the 10 commandments at the time of Jesus. And then we're going to jump forward today. What's about the 10 commandments today? How should we as believers look at the 10 commandments under the New Testament of grace? Now, scholars have always debated whether or not the 10 commandments were in the 2 tablets, where maybe 4 of them were on one side and the other 6 were on the other side, or 5 and 5 on each side. Most scholars now believe that the 10 commandments, all 10 of them were on one side and all 10 of them were on the other side. And where they get that historically is because when a sovereign or a king established a covenant, a feudal covenant with his subjects, where he promised protection and help and safety in exchange for their fidelity and loyalty and pledge of support, uh, they would create these on tablets where one side was for the sovereign and one side was for the subject. And so the complete treaty was on both sides of the tablet. And so they're saying because of the historical way that treaties between a sovereign and subject were documented or put on stone tablets, that the Ten Commandments were on both sides. When we look at the Jewish law, and we're going to get into the next few, probably a month or 2 months of looking at Jewish law, most scholars break it down into 3 categories. And we start with what they call the moral law. Now, sometimes it's referred to as the law of God. The law of God is what Thomas Jefferson referred to, that all men are created and endowed with certain inalienable rights that come from their creator. These are rights that come from the creator himself, the law of God. This, if you look at it that way, the law of God doesn't show favoritism. It's a law of God for all mankind. It's a law that applies, it's a standard that exists subject to, it sets the standard. The Ten Commandments set the moral standard of God as a holy God. It's unchanging. It's a standard that's unchanging. I had a pastor when I was going to law school that said, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Well, the moral code, the moral law of God stands, and it's an anchor upon which we know in Western civilization, all laws really flow from the Ten Commandments. To secular Jews, non-believing Gentiles, and maybe philosophers, well, they don't believe in God, so they call it the law of nature. John Locke used the law of nature to write his thesis, upon which our founding fathers developed some of their concepts about government and moral law. When we talk about Jewish moral law, we're talking about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the Jewish moral law. They are God's law applied to the Jews. And it became the foundation upon which God promised as a sovereign the blessings that would flow to his people if they obeyed him. And if they didn't obey him, then the curses would come. So it was a conditional type of a covenant relationship between God, the sovereign, and Israel, the people that were subject to God, and it was conditioned on obedience. And so we're going to see how in next week, how whether or not did that create what a lot of us ascribe to the Old Testament is salvation by works or righteousness by works. Oftentimes we break the Bible down into 2 parts, an Old Testament, New Testament, and they say the Old Testament of works, the New Testament of grace. We're going to talk about that in more detail. But after you had the moral law, the next thing, and we're going to go into, is the Jewish ceremonial law. The Jewish ceremonial law are all of the temple sacrifices, all the temple procedures, it established the Levite priesthood to act as an intermediary between the people and God. It's a priest that actually performed the sacrifices. Who performed the sacrifices before the Levite priests? Well, usually were the elders of the different tribes that would do the sacrifices. In the Passover, the head of the families sacrificed the Paschal lamb. So the ceremonial law is all the sacrifices and the Levite priesthood and all of the procedures that they went through, or the rules that applied to these sacrifices. We can look back today from the New Testament standpoint, and we can say, boy, what they're doing in these Jewish sacrifices, they all point to Jesus Christ. Well, God intended them to point to Jesus Christ. Did the Jewish people at the time performing these sacrifices know that it pointed to Jesus Christ? Uh, Probably not. And we're going to look at it again next week in more detail. Now, the last area is what we call the Jewish civil law. And this is where you get into all of the rules and regulations about how it governed the people of Israel and their day-to-day affairs. It was a judicial and the all the detailed laws. You on the Sabbath you couldn't go so far without breaking the Sabbath of resting. All the laws dealing with what foods to eat, and a lot of these rules and laws are mentioned in the book of Leviticus, a very difficult book to study because it's tedious. It's like reading the dictionary. You just go on and on with all these rules and regulations. We'll talk about whether we want to dive into Leviticus in detail or we want to cover it in category or whatever when we get to that point. Now, what I want to do is introduce something that we'll expound upon later on, and that is that we're going to ultimately end this class on the Ten Commandments with the relevance and application of the Ten Commandments, the ceremonial law, and the civil law of the Jewish people to the New Testament Christian believer. And we're going to look at that. But when we look at the relevance and application of these three categories of Jewish law and how we should look at them today, we're really looking at 2,000 years of analysis, study, scholarship of the Bible. Over 2,000 years, we've had a lot of scholarship. Probably no other book has been written about, analyzed, studied more than the Bible itself. And it starts with very brilliant people of faith, and people that were not so much of faith, they're apostate, and their interpretations of the Bible. But over these 2,000 years, basically two categories were developed that talked about how God related to mankind and and this is as explained by the Bible. And when we talk about these two basic categories or frameworks that people look at the Bible and how God relates to mankind as revealed by the Bible, we're looking at dispensationalism or covenant theology. Now there's spin-off on these, and I'm sure some of you have heard these words like, are you a dispensationalist? Are you a covenantist? And you think, well, what exactly do these words mean? And why should we study them? These are a way of scholarship that we analyze the Bible, but they really help us understand why we come to the beliefs that we do. Do the Ten Commandments apply to the Christian today? Well, that may mean that you're a dispensationalist or you're a covenantist. And so I want to introduce those thoughts to you because as we go through the study of the Ten Commandments, we'll get into more detail. But what is dispensationalism? Well, what it is nothing more than it teaches that God dealt with mankind in a series or a sequential periods of time, where during one period of time he acted one way, and then as history changed, he acted differently, and we go through these sequential dispensations to the end times. It's not that God changes, it's that history move forward, and sequentially there are periods of time. For instance, it starts with the dispensational period of Adam and Eve in the garden, and they call that the dispensation of innocence. That's where Adam and Eve walked with God. They did not know the difference between right and wrong. They had not disobeyed God, and so that was a period of time where God related with mankind, Adam and Eve, in a certain way. And then when they disobeyed God and they were removed from the garden, then God acted with mankind differently. And so what we're seeing is that God dealing with people differently all the way through to the end times. And it ends with the millennial period. And so what we do is we analyze God's interaction with humanity based upon periods of time. Now, in covenant theology, it looks at it in a different way from periods of time. It looks at God's relationship with man is a relationship established by covenants. And each covenant was a way of which God dealt with man. One of the covenants we're going to deal with is the Mosaic covenant or the Sinai covenant or the Ten Commandments. But again, it's instead of looking at periods of time, we're looking at covenants. And some covenants, they're not restricted to a period of time. For instance, the covenant which God made with Abraham, where he promised Abraham that not only would his descendants be a great nation. In covenant theology, they say, well, the new church, the Christian church, is the new Israel. And the covenant that applied to Abraham applies to us in the New Testament. You see how it works? It's not tied to a period of time. It's tied to a covenant or promise. What you have are the dispensationists, very little a literal translation of the scriptures. When God promised in the Davidic dispensation that David would reign on the throne, they mean that David in the millennial period would actually sit on the throne. Well, you're not a dispensationist if you think that David is not going to sit on the throne, because that throne is occupied by Jesus Christ. And so you would say that would make you more of a covenant type of person. We'll go into more detail on this, but just as long as you understand the concept, is we're going to focus on the Ten Commandments, and it's very hard to focus on these without saying, are we dealing with a dispensational era of time that applies only to Israel, or are we dealing with a covenant that may apply to us in the church age? And so just with that introduction, I hope I introduced two terms that you'll better understand what Christians mean when they say, are you a dispensationist? I remember, we remember Steve Donahue was part of our congregation, and he didn't believe in the dispensational theory of the millennium. Well, what was that? Well, in the end times, Israel literally will occupy Jerusalem, and the people that are in Israel today are the Jewish people coming back to fulfill the dispensation of Israel in the end times. See how that works? And so that makes them a dispensationist. Now, a lot of people say, well, Israel, the people that are there, they're not even really good Jews. They're secular Jews. And they can't possibly be God's people that are going to inherit the kingdom of heaven at the end times. So these things come from these two major schools of thought. And you'll find as you go through and understand, I'll have a chart next week that talks about all the things that the dispensationalists believe and all the ones at the covenant. And you're going to find that, well, I accept this from the dispensational theory and I accept this from the covenant theory. You're going to find out you're a little bit of both. I asked Pastor the question, are Baptist dispensationalists? And while the Baptist church is known to be dispensational, Pastor struck his head. He said, well, some are. Because a lot of people just don't understand what these are, but it sure helps you understand why you believe what you believe. The main message that I want you to receive from the lesson tonight is that God provided the Ten Commandments to Israel in order to establish a holy relationship between himself and his people. And that's why I started the lesson with the quote, be holy because I am holy. And the Ten Commandments are God's moral law. It establishes a relationship of holiness between God and his people. We're going to talk about this first encounter with the Ten Commandments in Israel arriving at the mountain of God, preparing to speak, for God to speak to them, God appearing on the mountain, and then promulgating or giving them the Ten Commandments. And we'll end up with some conclusions and applications. Well, we've been studying the Exodus where Israel left Egypt. When they did, that started the new clock running, the new calendar. And so we're in the third month after the Israelis left Egypt. And all these things have already happened. God parted the Red Sea. He provided water at Marah. Moses struck the rock and water flowed from the rock. They fought the Amalekites, and now they're at the base of the mountain of God. If you remember in Exodus earlier, when God first called Moses, he told Moses, I'm going to give you a sign. When you take the people out of Egypt, you bring them to this mountain, and they will know that I sent you. Well, how are they going to know? Because God is going to speak to 2 million people, and he's going to speak to them with Moses in between the people and God on the mountain. And so Moses was commissioned. And what did he say to Pharaoh? Let us go out into the wilderness and worship God. Well, here we are. We're at the mountain of God. It's the 3rd month. Now, they came on the 3rd month after they left Egypt. 3 is a word or a term, a number that always talks about manifestation of God. 3 in the Trinity. God manifested in 3 personhoods. Okay, so it's significant in the Bible that on the 3rd month, they're at the mountain of God. And we're going to see this repeated because God appears to the Israeli people on the 3rd day of the 3rd month. A double manifestation. Now, God called them to the mountain for a purpose. Now, if we remember Genesis, God gave the covenant to Abraham, but he had to reestablish the covenant with Isaac. And then he had to reestablish the covenant with Jacob. And then we're at the mountain. He needs to establish his covenant with the nation that arrived at the mountain. God reestablishes his covenant with the people. Now, although Israel had seen God's power in the 10 plagues that troubled Egypt, that punished Egypt, judged Egypt, in the parting of the Red Sea, they saw God's power and they saw his Shekinah glory. They saw the cloud and the pillar that guided them through the wilderness. It protected them at the Red Sea. And they also saw God's miraculous provisions, changing the bitter water into drinkable water, striking the rock and providing water, winning the victory against the Amalekites as Moses held his hands up in petition to God. They saw all those miraculous provisions, the manna from heaven, but they never had a direct contact with God. With the mountain of God, they have a direct contact with God. They hear his voice. So after they arrived at the mountain, God calls Moses up and he tells Moses what's going to happen. And in Exodus 19, verses 3 and 6, then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you're to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings, Isaiah, and brought you to myself. Now obey me fully and keep my covenant. Then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, Hebrews, and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. He says, Moses, you did what I asked you to. You came to the mountain. You brought the people out of Egypt. But now I want to establish a covenant. And he gives a purpose for the covenant. The purpose is to make his people a holy treasure. God is holy. He wants his people to be holy. Now, God is asserting his claim. This is not a negotiated treaty between equal parties. In contract law, we call this an adhesion contract. Very coercive. And God is saying, I claim sovereignty over the people for 2 reasons. I'm their creator. He created everybody, the whole world, and I brought you out of Egypt. I am your sovereign because of what I've done, and I have a right to claim your obedience. And so he's saying that he he is justified, or he is in his position of God, he is claiming this covenant and proclaiming that obedience should come from his people. So what were the exchange of the covenant? God promised to be faithful to protect and bless his people if they obeyed him. And he promised curses if they didn't. It's a conditional covenant. Now, Moses hears this from God, and he goes down and he does what God tells him to do. He goes and tells the Israelite people, you're going to meet God in 3 days. And so he goes down and he summons the elders of the people. These are the tribal leaders, and sent before them. He told them everything that the Lord had commanded him to speak. And then the elders kind of marshaled their tribes and their clans, and they responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses says, okay, they're willing to go into this thing and meet God and meet the covenant. They didn't know what the covenant was, but they knew what God was. And so they were really basically saying, we accept God's sovereignty. And so Moses went back to the mountain. Now, a lot of people say this is the first time that God demanded obedience, is this covenant. And you get a lot of distraction there. But we already studied that God demanded obedience from Israel prior to this. If you remember when they were at Marah, where the bitter water was there, and God pointed out a branch or a tree and he threw it into the water and it became drinkable water, and the people were complaining, but then they got the water. Well, then after that event, in Exodus 15, verses 25 and 26, it said, there the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. He said, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. So he's already preparing Israel to be obedient to his commands. He's already telling them that he has decrees. We're going to see the fruition of that later. Now, if you remember in the desert of Sin, God commanded the Israelites to gather as much manna as they could, and they needed for each day for 5 days. And then on the 6th day, he said, gather a double portion, because on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there's not going to be any manna. And yet, some of the people went out and tested God. On the 7th day, the Sabbath, they went out to gather manna. Some tried to save manna from what they gathered each day and keep it overnight, and it spoiled. And then God, seeing this, went to Moses and said, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? So God had already set the stage for giving commands and expecting obedience from his people. But none of these commands established a moral covenant relationship between God and Israel. He was just setting forth his expectation that the people obey his commands. At the mountain of God, with the 10 commandments, God establishes this holy relationship with his people. So the next step is that the stage is set, and God says, okay, Moses, now you need to prepare the people for hearing me from the mountain. And so God revealed to Moses that he would appear and speak to Moses, and the people would hear his voice. In Exodus 19:9, he said, the Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. In other words, they agreed that they would listen and obey the Lord, although they didn't know what they're agreeing to. But now he's saying, I'm going to speak to all the people. Now, we all know there's a difference between observing what God has done and experiencing God directly. We experience what God has done every day. We go and look at his creation. We look at the mountains. We look at the weather. We look at the universe, and we can see what God's done. But that's a far different thing than experience God personally. And so what we're seeing here is God is preparing to have a relationship with his people, and to speak personally to them. So before God would speak to the people of Israel, they needed to be consecrated. They needed to be symbolically clean. They had to be prepared to meet and speak with the Holy God. So the Lord said to Moses in Exodus 19, verses 10 through 13, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready on the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not go up to the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. He shall surely be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid upon him. Whether man or animal, he shall not be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they go up to the mountain. I kind of like to think of a big concert. And if you go to a concert and all the rock stars are up on the stage, what do you see? You see big, huge guards standing in front of the stage. And they're not going to let you get up on the stage. And I kind of think that this is what God was doing with the mountain God. He said, Moses, don't let these people go on the mountain. And if they do, they're going to be put to death. They're going to be stoned, or an arrow's going to shoot them. You've got to do this. If you don't, what would God do? Well, he'd maybe send a plague on the people or what? But God is holy. Even though the people are consecrated, they are not to go on the mountain. Moses learned this lesson when he first met God. He saw a burning bush and he approached it because he was curious. And then Moses says, take off your sandals, for you're on holy ground. So these people had to be prepared to have their encounter, but they were still not holy people. And God sets the conditions for people to approach him. He was teaching Israel that God is holy, and they must recognize his holiness. Now, anticipating their encounter with God, Israel did do what Moses said. They consecrated themselves. So after Moses went down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes, and he said to the people, prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations. I'm not sure whether or not there's anything in the Bible saying some people can go off on what we call a red herring and say that sexual relations with your spouse is immoral. It's just a way of saying, look, I want you to focus on what's going to happen in the next 3 days. You're going to have an encounter with God. Don't get yourself messed up with your family relations and all that stuff. Concentrate on what's going to happen. It's a focus type of thing, admonition. So now we're going to get to the third section, and that is that God appeared on the mountain of God and spoke to Israel. So on Exodus 19, 16 through 19, we get this. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. A lot of scholars try to explain this, saying, well, this is a mountain that had volcanic activity. And they use it as a basis. Let's find the real Sinai, let's look for a mountain that was a volcano. No, this is not what happened. The mountain trembled because God was present. God was on the mountain. This didn't come from the mountain. This was God present on the mountain. This happened on the third day of the third month, the manifestation of God. God's appearance was manifested by meteorological events, thunder, lightning, sounds, a trumpet blast, which announced the trumpet blast was a call for assembly. When you heard that, you'll see later when we study the scriptures that one trumpet blast meant be on alert, two meant to come. These trumpet blasts had significance. The trumpet blast announced the presence of God. This was terrifying. The people were scared. They were scared out of their willies. Um, so what we have here is God asking Moses to come up to the mountain one more time and reminding Moses to go back and make sure people don't go on the mountain. This is God's grace. He's saying he knows human nature. Moses was curious to see what the burning bush was, and he didn't take off his sandals. People would be curious. Some people would be even terrified, bold to go up there and on the mountain. So God reminded Moses to keep these people off the mountain. He said, the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up on Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain, set it apart as holy. The Lord replied, go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. Boy, the stage is set. And now we get the Ten Commandments. After Moses returned from the mountain, God identifies himself and gives the Ten Commandments. He presents the Decalogue. Now, I don't have to go through the scriptures that are in this part here about the Ten Commandments. Thanks to Nelson's hard work, we heard the Ten Commandments. But what we need is to talk about the significance. These commandments were presented as a covenant which bound Israel to the Lord as their absolute sovereign and obligated him to obey his commands. We know this because later, when Moses is telling the next generation of Israelites before they go into the promised land, he's telling about this event that happened with the earlier generation at Mount Sinai. And he says, the Lord our God made a covenant with this at Horeb. It was not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive today. This is the covenant to the nation of Israel, generation to generation to generation. The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire of the mountain. At that time I stood between the Lord and you to declare you the word of the Lord, because you were afraid of the fire and did not go up on the mountain. Some people say that, no, God didn't speak for all the Israelites to hear. I think the Bible is very clear. God spoke to everyone. His voice could be heard by everyone. And so his voice. Now, if I were trying to replicate this, would I have a voice like the voice that was on the film that Nelson showed us? A deep, heavy voice? Would I have a George Patton voice? George Patton's voice was not a George C. Scott voice. It was a high-pitched, squeaky voice like this. And you think, here's this commander of a general with a high, squeaky voice. This was a powerful voice. I can only imagine what God would sound like. This is the conditional covenant we talked about. It was a conditional covenant to establish a holy relationship, a moral law, a standard of conduct between Israel and God. God expected his people to be moral. He expected his people to be holy. I like to look at it a little bit differently, and we're going to expand this theme next week. This is a covenant of love. When you look at the first 4 commandments, to honor one God, not to worship idols, not to take the Lord's name in vain, and to honor the Sabbath, first 4 commandments are about loving God. Loving God means you worship the one true God. Loving God requires people not to diminish God's glory by worshiping something else, an idol. Loving God requires people to honor God's holiness, not to take his name in vain, not to use it loosely. Loving God requires people to keep the Sabbath and keep it holy. When we talk about loving God, we're talking about recognizing who God is. Sometimes then I think a lot of Christians take God too casually. He's daddy. We just talk to him. And we can just flippantly flip up a prayer to him. God wants us to talk to him, but God is holy. He's the creator of the universe. And so the first 4 commandments remind us. The last 6 commandments really deal with dealing with people, how you deal with your parents, honor your parents in the 5th commandment. Do not commit murder, adultery, do not steal, or do not bear false witness. Those commandments all apply, the 6th through the 9th commandment, to how we treat other people. And the last commandment, not coveting what other people have or what they are. This is how you love people. And I think Jesus was talking about these are a covenant of love between God and his people, because when he was asked the question about the 10 commandments, he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That's the first 4 commandments. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the next 6 commandments. These commandments were a commandment of love. If you use God's power, the Holy Spirit, to love other people, to love God first and love other people, these commandments can be fulfilled in the New Testament because they are commandments of love. Now, having heard God's voice, having received these commandments, people did not want to go through this experience again. So we end this lesson with the scripture from Exodus 20, 18 through 21, where basically the people are telling Moses, we don't want to go this close to God again. Why don't you intercede with us for us? We need a mediator. You go to speak to God, and then you tell us what God says, and we'll follow what you say. And so that's essentially what Exodus 20, 18 through 21 says. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. This is a transition where the people basically said, Moses, take a hike. He said, you go up to the mountain, God, and speak. We're going to stay down here. Well, we know that Moses went up on the mountain. He stays there for 40 days. He hears noise as he's coming down the mountain. And what are the people doing? They're making a golden calf. So we're going to see, is this a commandment that dispenses a moral law to establish a covenant relationship between a holy God who expects his people to be obedient and holy to him? Is this a covenant of works? Is it a covenant of grace? We'll get into that next week. But I want to conclude with these applications. God's holy law applies to all mankind and makes all of us, as human beings created in God's image, responsible and accountable for our thoughts and actions. As our Creator and Redeemer, God has a justifiable reason to hold us responsible to obey his moral law. Our relationship with God must recognize that God is holy. The law of holiness or righteousness is ultimately fulfilled by Christ. Christ's righteousness is imputed to us when we have faith in who he is and what he has done to fulfill God's commandment for us to be holy because God is holy. So I have these 3 scriptures that I quoted from Leviticus, Romans, and 1 Corinthians, all dealing with holiness. Leviticus 20, 7 and 8 says, consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. And then Romans 11, 16, he's talking about Jesus. And he says, if part of the dough offered as first fruits, Jesus, is holy, then the whole batch is holy, those that believe in Christ. If the root is holy, so are the branches. And then in 1 Corinthians, he says, to the church of God in Corinth, to those sanctified in Christ Jesus and called to be holy, together with all those everywhere who call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, their Lord and ours. I think that we get the point. This is God's moral law. God is holy and we're called to be holy. And so when God spoke and established this covenant with his people on the mountain of Sinai, he was saying, I'm calling you to be a treasure, a holy treasure, precious to me because you're obedient. Is that any different today? We'll talk about that later. Anyway, that I think it gives you a completely different impression from the movie The Ten Commandments about how God presented his moral law to his people. That's it.